I hadn't even first sip of coffee when my manager stopped at my desk Monday morning. "Bring your laptop," he said. "HR needs to see you." That was it. No good morning. No explanation. He just turned around and started walking. For a second, I wondered if someone had scheduled a meeting without telling me. Maybe a client complaint, maybe another project getting delayed. It wasn't unusual for Mondays to start with surprises, but as we walked across the office, something felt off. He usually talked about traffic, football, or whatever happened over the weekend. This time, he didn't say a single word. People looked up as we passed their desks. One coworker gave me a quick smile. I smiled back without thinking. It was the last normal moment I'd have there. The HR conference room door was already open. Inside sat an HR manager I'd only met once before and another woman from employee relations. There was a folder on the table with my name printed on a label. Nobody asked me to sit. Nobody asked how my weekend was. The HR manager looked down at the folder, took a slow breath, and said, "We're ending your employment effective today." For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. I even let out a little laugh. Nobody else did. Then it hit me. This wasn't a meeting. I was being fired. I looked at my manager. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. 3 days earlier, we'd spent almost an hour planning a software rollout for one of our biggest clients. He'd approved my timeline. We joked about finally getting through a crazy quarter. Now he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "I'm sorry," I said. "Can you tell me what this is about?" The HR manager folded her hands. "You received written notice yesterday explaining the reason." I frowned. "No, I didn't." She glanced at my manager before looking back at me. "Our records show the email was successfully delivered Sunday afternoon. I never got an email." She nodded toward her laptop. "I can show you." She turned the screen around. The subject line was impossible to miss. Employment termination notice. For a split second, I wondered if I'd somehow deleted it by accident. Then I looked at the address. Something wasn't right. That's not my email. The room went quiet. The HR manager leaned closer to the screen. "It is the address on file." "No," I said, pointing at it. "My last name has 2 L's. That address only has 1. She stopped talking. My manager leaned over to look. Nobody moved for several seconds. Finally, HR clicked into my employee profile. There it was. My actual email address. The correct one. The same address the company had been sending pay stubs, benefits updates, calendar invites, and security alerts to for almost 6 years. She had been looking at the wrong address. I waited for someone to say, "We're sorry," or maybe, "We'll need to postpone this." Instead, the HR manager slowly closed her laptop. "The email issue doesn't change today's decision." I blinked. "I'm sorry." "What?" "The termination is still effective immediately." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You sent the termination notice to someone else. The notice was only a formality." "A formality?" I repeated. I never even knew this meeting was happening. The investigation was already complete. "What investigation?" She looked down at the folder again. "You violated company policy by sharing confidential client information." My stomach dropped. "No, I didn't." "You were found to have disclosed protected implementation materials." I absolutely was not. I knew exactly which project they were talking about. It had been a difficult client, but I also knew I had refused every request that crossed the line. My own manager had backed me up more than once. I turned toward him. "Tell them." He rubbed his forehead. "I can't discuss the investigation." That answer bothered me more than the accusation. Not because he defended HR, because he sounded like someone repeating words he'd been told to use. I asked to see the evidence. HR said legal had already reviewed it. I asked what files I'd supposedly shared. They wouldn't tell me. I asked who accused me. No answer. Every question ended the same way. The decision is final. The meeting lasted maybe 15 minutes. It felt like an hour. When it was over, someone from security showed up outside the conference room. That was when the embarrassment finally caught up with me. He wasn't rude. He simply walked beside me while I packed my things, my headphones, my family picture, the coffee mug my daughter gave me for Father's Day. People pretended not to watch, but everyone watched. A few whispered. One teammate started walking over before another minutes. It felt like an hour. When it was over, someone from security showed up outside the conference room. That was when the embarrassment finally caught up with me. He wasn't rude. He simply walked beside me while I packed my things, my headphones, my family picture, the coffee mug my daughter gave me for Father's Day. People pretended not to watch, but everyone watched. A few whispered. One teammate started walking over before another quietly pulled him back. No one wanted to be the next person HR noticed. As I put my laptop into the return bag, Melissa from my team caught my eye. She looked completely confused. Not guilty. Not nervous. Confused. Like she couldn't understand why I was the one leaving. When I reached the elevator, she hurried over. What happened? They fired me. What? They said I shared confidential client information. She stared at me. That doesn't make any sense. I know. The elevator doors opened. Just before they closed, she said something that stayed in my head all the way home. Did they ask you about the Teams messages? The doors shut before I could answer. I hadn't heard anyone mention Teams once. At the time, I thought the biggest mistake HR had made was sending my termination email to the wrong address. I had no idea that was actually the smallest mistake they'd made that week. It was sending my termination email to the wrong address. I had no idea that was actually the smallest mistake they'd made that week. I got home, most of my neighbors had even left for lunch. My wife opened the front door, smiled, and asked, "Why are you home so early?" I didn't answer right away. I just handed her the cardboard box. Her smile disappeared. We sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour going over everything I could remember. Every question she asked had the same answer. I don't know. I really don't know. The worst part wasn't losing the paycheck. It was not understanding why it had happened. That afternoon, I logged into my personal email expecting to find at least something from HR. Nothing. No follow-up. No termination paperwork. No explanation. The only thing waiting for me was a calendar reminder for a dentist appointment I'd completely forgotten about. Around 6 that evening, my phone buzzed. Melissa. I didn't want to call while you were still there, she said. You can talk now. She lowered her voice anyway. I've been thinking about what HR accused you of. So have I. They mentioned confidential information? Yeah. Another pause. Did they show you any messages? No. Her silence lasted just long enough to make me sit up straighter. They asked me about one Teams conversation last week. My stomach tightened. What conversation? The one with the Westbridge project. I immediately knew the one. Westbridge had been one of our most difficult clients all year. Every other meeting felt like an argument. They constantly asked for things they weren't supposed to receive. Sometimes they wanted reports from other clients. Sometimes they wanted workflow templates that weren't theirs. Every request had to be handled carefully. Melissa continued. Compliance asked whether you agreed to send another client's implementation documents. I never agreed. I know. Did you tell them that? I did. So why am I fired? I don't know. She sounded genuinely frustrated. Something about the screenshots felt incomplete. What do you mean? They showed me part of a Teams conversation. Part? There were messages missing. I leaned forward. Missing how? The conversation jumped. She hesitated. I remember reading your reply that morning because it shut the whole discussion down. What reply? You told everyone we couldn't share another client's materials because it violated company policy. I remembered writing exactly that, word for word. But that message wasn't in the screenshots? No. Instead, according to Melissa, the conversation jumped from a client request straight to someone thanking everyone for the discussion. Without my response in the middle, it looked like nobody had objected. It looked like everyone agreed, including me. Are you sure? I'm positive. How? Because I laughed when you wrote it. Laughed? You said, I'd rather survive another Monday than another compliance audit. I smiled despite everything. That sounded exactly like something I'd say. There was no way I'd imagined it. Melissa kept going. I remember because everyone reacted with those little laughing emojis. If that message is gone, the whole conversation changes. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since the elevator. Why didn't you tell HR? I tried. My head snapped up. What? They told me they already had the complete export from IT. So they didn't want to hear anything else? They said the investigation was already finished. That sentence sounded familiar. It was exactly what HR had told me that morning. The investigation was already complete, except now I wasn't so sure it ever had been. Before hanging up, Melissa said one more thing. I don't think your manager wanted this. That surprised me. He didn't exactly defend me. No. But when HR interviewed me, he kept asking if there were any other messages they should review. What did they say? They said legal already had everything. After we hung up, I opened the notebook I always kept beside my home desk. I'd used it for months to track project meetings, client requests, and follow-up tasks. Most people use digital notes. I still liked writing things down. I flipped back to the Westbridge project. There it was. A note from 3 weeks earlier. Rejected request for another client's workflow. Confirmed with Mark before responding. Mark, my manager, which meant he already knew I'd refused the request. I stared at that page for a long time. Either my manager had completely forgotten what happened, or someone else had shown him a version of the story that looked very different from the one I remembered. The Westbridge project. There it was. A note from 3 weeks earlier. Rejected request for another client's workflow. Confirmed with Mark before responding. Mark, my manager, which meant he already knew I'd refused the request. I stared at that page for a long time. Either my manager had completely forgotten what happened, or someone else had shown him a version of the story that looked very different from the one I remembered. Very different from the one I remembered. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the meeting with HR, the wrong email, the missing Teams messages, my manager refusing to answer simple questions. None of it fit together. Around 8 the next morning, I sent a short email to HR from my personal account. I asked for copies of the evidence used in the investigation. I also asked for the date the investigation had started and whether I'd been interviewed. The response came less than an hour later. Your employment has ended. We consider this matter closed. That was it. One sentence. No attachments. No answers. I tried legal next. Nothing. I emailed my former manager. To my surprise, he called that afternoon. His voice sounded tired. I can't talk long. I only need one answer. Silence. Did you remember approving my response to Westbridge? Another pause. I can't discuss internal investigations. You didn't answer my question. I know. Mark, you were in the meeting. I know. You told me not to send those files. I know. That was the first honest thing he'd said. So why am I the one who got fired? He let out a long breath. I told them to review everything. And I assumed they did. The call ended a minute later. He never defended HR, but he never defended me either. I spent the next few days updating my resume and applying for jobs. It felt strange. On paper, I looked like someone who had simply left a stable career. In reality, I had no idea how to explain why I'd been fired. Then, almost a week later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Hey, it's David from IT. I knew David. We'd worked together on several software deployments over the years. He sounded nervous. I probably shouldn't be calling. You've got my attention. I heard what happened. So did half the company. He gave a quiet laugh, then became serious again. I was asked to pull archive logs for another review yesterday. What kind of review? I don't know, but I noticed something weird. I grabbed a pen. What? The team's conversation from Westbridge was exported twice. I frowned. Twice? Yeah. The first export had 23 messages. The second only had 17. I looked down at my notebook. Which one did HR get? I honestly don't know. Why would there be two versions? I've been trying to figure that out. He lowered his voice. I checked the timestamps. And the shorter version was created after the team's archive migration over the weekend. I didn't fully understand what that meant. So, messages disappeared? I don't know if they disappeared, but something definitely changed. Could someone have edited it? Not easily. Then what happened? I think the export tool glitched. You think? I've seen it happen once before. That caught my attention. When? Last year. What did it do? It skipped messages during an export. Was it fixed? Eventually. But nobody notices unless they compare two exports side by side. I leaned back in my chair. So HR may have been looking at an incomplete conversation. I can't prove that. But if I were you, he stopped talking. If you were me, I'd ask for every document in my personnel file. Can I even do that? I'd ask a lawyer. After we hung up, I stared at my notebook again. For the first time since Monday, I felt something other than anger. I felt hope. Because if David was right, then HR hadn't fired me based on what actually happened. They'd fired me based on a version of the story that was missing 6 messages, and I couldn't stop wondering what else those missing messages might have changed. I wasn't looking to sue anyone. I just wanted to know what had actually happened. A friend from church recommended an employment attorney. I met him the following Friday. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question. Did they ever let you respond to the accusation before they fired you? No. They never interviewed you? No. They never showed you the evidence? No. He nodded once and wrote something on a yellow legal pad. We'll start by requesting your personnel file. That's it? For now. He explained that companies usually keep records of investigations, interview notes, emails, and supporting documents. If everything had been handled correctly, the paperwork would tell the story. If it hadn't, that would tell a story too. About 3 weeks passed. I was interviewing for new jobs during the day and checking my email every hour. Most interviews went well until someone asked the obvious question. So, why did you leave your last company? I hated that question. I'd usually say it wasn't my decision. Then I'd watch their expression change. One recruiter never called me back. Another politely ended the interview 10 minutes early. I started wondering if one bad Monday was going to follow me for the rest of my career. Then my attorney called. They responded. Did they send the file? Most of it. Most? They're still collecting a few technical records. What does that mean? It means they found something. Before I could ask another question, he added, "Don't get excited yet." That was impossible. A few days later, another envelope arrived. This one was much thicker. My attorney invited me to his office instead of emailing the documents. When I walked in, several pages were already spread across his conference table. He pointed to one of them. Do you recognize this? It was the team's conversation, or at least part of it. I immediately noticed the gap Melissa had described. The discussion jumped from the client's request straight to someone saying, "Sounds good." My message wasn't there. Neither were several replies from other teammates. This is what they used, I asked. He nodded. Looks that way. Then he slid another packet across the table. This came from IT. At first glance, it looked identical. Same date, same participants, same conversation. Except this version kept going. There they were. My missing messages. The first one read almost exactly as I remembered. We can't share another client's implementation documents. That would violate company policy. Underneath it, Mark had replied, "Agreed. Let's offer them a clean template instead." Then Melissa had added a thumbs up. 2 other teammates had reacted with laughing emojis after I joked about surviving another Monday instead of another compliance audit. Everything she remembered was right there. I looked up at my attorney. So they fired me for refusing to break the rules. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped another document sitting underneath the chat logs. It was an internal IT report. The report explained that a weekend archive migration had caused intermittent export errors for certain teams' conversations. Most users never noticed because the original chats were still intact. The problem only appeared when someone exported specific conversations during that window. My attorney leaned back. Here's where this gets interesting. The export HR relied on was created Monday morning. The incomplete one? Yes. The complete export was generated later that same week. I stared at him. So they eventually had the correct version? He nodded. They did. And they still left me fired? He folded his hands. That's the question I'd like them to answer. Yes, same week. I stared at him. So they eventually had the correct version? He nodded. They did. And they still left me fired? He folded his hands. That's the question I'd like them to answer. Yes, about a week, my attorney called again. This time, he sounded different. They want to talk. Who? The company's attorney. I figured they wanted to argue. Maybe they'd insist the missing messages didn't matter. Maybe they'd double down and say they had other evidence. Instead, the first thing their attorney said during the conference call caught me completely off guard. We're interested in resolving this before litigation. I looked at my attorney. We hadn't even filed a lawsuit. We'd requested records. That was it. My attorney stayed calm. What exactly are you trying to resolve? There was a short pause. The separation of your client from the company. That wasn't an answer. It was corporate language. My attorney pushed a little harder. Is the company standing by the original reason for termination? Another pause. We've identified procedural issues. Procedural issues. That was the phrase they chose. Not the wrong email, not the incomplete Teams export. Just the wrong email, not the incomplete Teams export. Just procedural issues. After the call ended, I asked my attorney what he thought. I think someone finally reviewed the complete file. A few days later, we received a draft settlement agreement. It included several months of salary, payment for my unused vacation, continued health insurance for a while, and something I cared about more than the money. The company agreed to change my employment record. Instead of terminated for policy violation, it would simply state that my employment ended through a mutual separation. Future background checks would reflect that change. I read that sentence 3 times. It felt like someone had finally admitted I wasn't the person they'd accused me of being. Not publicly, not directly, but enough to matter. Before I signed anything, I asked my attorney one last question. Does this mean they know they were wrong? He smiled a little. Companies almost never say those words. So I'll never know? Oh, I think you already do. I signed the agreement. A month later, I started a new job with another software company. During the interview process, I told them my previous employer had gone through a difficult separation and that had been resolved. They didn't press for details. They cared more about my experience than the paperwork. About 2 months into the new job, my phone rang while I was eating lunch in the cafeteria. The caller ID said Mark. I stepped outside. Hey, he replied quietly. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I almost didn't. He laughed once. It sounded tired. I owe you an apology. I leaned against the wall but didn't say anything. I should have pushed harder. What happened? When HR showed me the chat export, I told them it didn't look right. That got my attention. You did? They said legal had already verified it. So you trusted them? I did, he sighed. That was my mistake. I asked him the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for months. When did you realize the messages were missing? The day after you left. What? Melissa asked me why your joke wasn't in the conversation. The Monday joke? Yeah. I remembered laughing at it. He let out another long breath. That's when I knew something wasn't adding up. So why didn't anyone stop the termination? We tried. Tried? By the time IT confirmed the export problem, HR had already finalized everything, and nobody wanted to admit they'd fired the wrong person. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Silence answered for him. Before we hung up, he said something I still think about. I hope your new company knows what they have. That was the closest thing to a compliment he'd ever given me. About 6 months later, Melissa sent me a picture from the old office. The HR conference room had been remodeled. New carpet, new chairs, fresh paint. I laughed when I saw it, not because the room looked different, because for the first time since that Monday morning, it was just another conference room. It didn't have any power over me anymore. These days, whenever I send an important email, I check the address twice before I hit send. One missing letter started the worst week of my career. The people who refused to slow down turned it into the biggest mistake of theirs. I checked the address twice before I hit send. One missing letter started the worst week of my career. The people who refused to slow down turned it into the biggest mistake of theirs.